Yeah, Jacob, if you can mute that screen or computer.
I'm just going to turn it off.
Yeah.
That's there. Okay, sorry about that. Is that better? Testing 1, 2, 3. You still hear? Do you hear anything now? Back up.
I think we are mostly okay. Just give me 1 second, please. I'm just making sure that the stream is on. Again, we would thank everyone for your patience. Okay, wonderful. We are on. Okay, now we are good, Jacob. So what we'll do is, thank you so much, everyone. Jacob, we are still getting that if like the computer's audio can be fully off rather than merely Zoom being on mute on that account, that will hopefully resolve it. So good evening, everyone. We are live. It's just a few minutes of delay. My name is Ahmed Selim Tekiloglu with CAIR-Philadelphia, and we are joined tonight for our webinar titled Seeking Hope in Syria Through Activism, with 2 expert names from the Syrian American community who has put years of effort in advocacy and policy work. Suzanne Meriden with Syrian American Council, the executive director, and Alzayat, the CEO of Emgage. Those are local to Pennsylvania here with us. Know that CAIR-Philadelphia works closely with Emgage on the C3 level, and we are happy that Alzayat, with his former policy expertise as well, where he was a senior advisor to former UN Ambassador Samantha Power, and had many other hats, both of them for joining us. So what we will do is I'll pass the floor briefly to CAIR-Philadelphia's Executive Director, Jacob Bender, for a quick welcome note. Then we'll go to our speakers. And we encourage everyone who is joining us on Zoom and on Facebook to please be engaged with your questions so that we can pose those to our speakers. Jacob.
Good evening. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. This is webinars brought to you by the Philadelphia chapter of CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations. For those of you who don't know or not familiar with CAIR, we're the largest Muslim advocacy and civil rights organization in the country. We primarily deal with domestic issues, but on occasion, particularly in times of crisis, in Syria and India, in Burma, wherever Muslim communities are being oppressed, we feel obligated as part of our mission statement to become involved in those issues, Palestine as well. And we take great pride and responsibility in the work we are doing in this time of COVID crisis and the pandemic, to find new ways to communicate with the Muslim community and the general public about issues of human rights and civil liberties around the world. So we thank both of you for participating in these efforts at these very difficult times. And I turn it now back to Ahmed. One last note, the presenting of these webinars takes a certain amount of money, and we would be most grateful for any donations you could make to help us produce these programs. And do you have the donation address on the screen, please? No, so it's gay.cair.com/donate. And we'll show it to you again at the end. So Ahmed, take it away. Thank you, dear guests, for participating. and those of you who have taken the time to, from your busy schedules, to participate in these educational and human rights efforts.
Thank you, Jacob, for that introduction. Thank you again to our guests. What we want to do first is for both of you to please, in addition to what I have said in the beginning, explain to us a little bit about your personal backgrounds, your connection to Syria, and your connection to this work, both individually and through your organizations. That will give us a good start to getting to know you and getting a hint of the main question we are trying to explore tonight, which is the question of activism, so that we can continue to hopefully engage in a more interactive way through the questions. Suzanne, let me invite you first. Thank you again. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Ahmed and Jacob, for having us and giving us the opportunity to speak about Syria. And Wael, it's always good to be in your presence. So a little bit about me. I'm currently the executive director of the Syrian American Council, but how I got here is a bit interesting because it's very different from my actual background. So I was actually born here in Florida, and both my parents are from Syria. And I never actually lived in Syria. However, when I was 1, we moved to the Middle East, Kuwait, Turkey, a few other places, and then got right back to the US when I was a teenager. And so even though I was not ever in Syria living, just from my parents' background visiting, it's always felt like a second home after my home here in the US. But also in, having conversations with my parents, my father especially, I really got to know what his life was like living in a country where your regime oppresses you, and that ignited in me the need to work for Syria and to really understand what Syria is all about. And interestingly enough, when I would visit Syria when I was younger, you'd hear stories. I recall one time pointing to a building and asking what that was, and my cousin literally slapping my hand down and saying, never point to government countries or government buildings, and don't ask questions. And I was very young and thought it was weird and didn't think too much of it, but those are memories that stuck with me. And today, as I work on a daily basis on the Syrian revolution, then I realized the severity of what was happening that I didn't recognize when I was so young. And same with my father. There were so many conversations we had, and I never understood why he was always in fear. He was always in fear of the government, and it would bother me so much when he was always such a straight man and doing everything so by law, etc. And then of course when the Syrian revolution started and it all sort of hit me, I recognized why my father was the way that he is. But anyway, I went to my schools, graduated college, and entered corporate retail. I loved every bit of my jobs and projects, and when the revolution started, I actually, I had done some activism, I had done some work, actually worked on some bills with CAIR, and I started to watch and see what my community was doing because of what was happening in Syria. And I always like to remind people how this all started, where people just went out into the streets to ask for freedom, and they were met with live ammunition from their own government. And I was watching my community sort of get stirred up and want to go out and protest. And it was all happening through the Syrian American Council chapter in Los Angeles, where I was residing. And at that point, I decided I have to join and be part of the movement. And really for the next 2 years, all I was doing at my desk was, working, talking to people and staff. But I was really on my phone, constantly watching what was happening in Syria. And I thought, before I get fired, I better leave and really focus on Syria 100%. And that's what I did. I left my career. I was volunteering with the Syrian American Council for a while, and then decided to go ahead and move to Washington, D.C. and work full time. And that's how I got here. And I'm so appreciative for the Syrian American Council for providing a space that really taught me so well with such wonderful and humble people on how to best serve a cause that's so important to me personally, but as an American, and as someone who experiences freedoms right here, I wanted to be able to provide that for others, especially the, my parents' families and their communities. And that's what I'm doing here at the Syrian American Council.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Suzanne. And I'm sure we'll go into deeper about the work of Syrian American Council, yes. And we'll be posting the website, and we will remind everyone to support the Syrian American Council's work as well. Let's move to Alzayat from Emgage. A little bit about yourself and a little bit about your connection to work and advocacy around Syria.
Thank you, Ahmed and Jacob and Suzanne. It's always great to see you. Hello and salam to everybody who's watching. Thank you for inviting me to speak and join you today to talk about Syria and related issues. I was born and raised in Damascus. I grew up there. I lived there. I went to school there. And we immigrated when I was 13 to the United States. And then I did the rest of my growing up in California. So obviously my connection to Syria is through that. I am from there, and all the family and friends that I knew there. But in terms of my work on Syria, that really came through the State Department. Until 4 years ago, I was a foreign policy expert focusing on the Middle East at the State Department. I had worked there for a total of 10 years. I had different assignments, primarily focused on Iraq and the Levant. But I had the opportunity to work for Ambassador Robert Ford, who was our last ambassador in Damascus, just when we shut down the embassy and he came back. And at the time, we were really still trying to maintain contacts with people inside of Syria without an embassy. So whether it was civil society actors, oppositionists, women's groups, and eventually rebels, people who had to take arms to defend themselves in communities, and including exiled political figures, etc. And I became one of the main liaisons with what is loosely referred to as the Syrian opposition. And so that was a very formative experience for me at the State Department. And I finished my career as former US Ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, where I worked with her on our policies on both Iraq and Syria. And I represented her here in Washington while she was in DC. That's really my work experience on Syria. It's from the US foreign policy, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. But the last 3.5 years, I've been CEO of Emgage, which is a national political and civic organization for Muslim Americans, and Emgage Action, which is our 501c4 issue advocacy organization, and Emgage PAC, which is our National Political Action Committee. And through those three organizations, we seek to increase Muslim voter turnout, advocate smartly on issues, domestic and foreign, and support candidates at the local, state, and national level who uphold our values. And we're very proud of our partnership with CAIR, who are partners of ours on a national program called the Million Muslim Votes campaign. You guys can go to millionmuslimvotes.com. It's a national campaign that now has over 10 organizations, whereby we're collectively working to turn out 1 million Muslim votes, not registering, but actually verifying that at least 1 million Muslim voters did vote. So check out the campaign. We're very proud of it. And we were really excited. And I know this is not a partisan event, but Joe Biden did attend the Million Muslim Votes Summit recently. And it's in a great recognition of the potential of the Muslim American voter. So let's make sure that we vote in November and exercise our constitutionally protected rights of voting. I'm looking forward to participating in this program.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Val, for that. And we are delighted to have individuals like both of you, both with personal and professional expertise on the subject. So I'll move into the questions, and the first one will be to Al. I'll ask you to please walk us through kind of the 101 of Syria and the current situation in Syria. And I know that's a hard task.
Are we going back 10 years, 100 years, or 10,000 years? Because it's all there.
Let's focus in the last maybe 10 years.
All right,
so.
sure.
In part, with a focus on, we call this the Syrian conflict. Some people call it the Syrian civil war. Some people call it the tragedy, and then there's a lot of confusion, so to speak, in terms of who is the opposition, who is the government, and all of that. So just briefly, for those who may not be so familiar with Syria, a brief, quick overview.
Sure. Well, so the Syrian situation, let's call it that, is really the byproduct of 50-year dictatorial rule by a single family and the mismanagement and abuse of the country, its resources, and its people, and the mismanagement and nefarious activities it imported to the region, whether it was Lebanon or even Iraq, or even other corners of the Arab world in the region. And the people of Syria had enough. Just like many other Arabic countries over the last 10 years, the people had enough. So they got out in the street and said, we want reform. And when they were met with bullets by the Syrian government and its military forces, the population called for the regime to step down, for Assad, the president, to step down. That was met with more bullets and more violence. And we're talking conventional weapons used against the civilian population. We're talking about Soviet-era tanks, Scud missiles. These are ballistic missiles, by the way, that you're supposed to launch hundreds of miles away at your enemies. Well, these were launched on Syrian cities. Field artillery, MiG fighters, helicopters, and the people, many of them, continued to protest peacefully and to form civil society groups, but some chose to pick up arms. And increasingly over time, you had military defectors from the Syrian army who said, enough, I don't want to kill my people. That's really the genesis or the beginning of the armed phase of the conflict, if you were to refer to it. And really, over time, the conflict became more and more brutal, with the regime employing more, violent tactics, with the deaths going into the hundreds of thousands, with the forced disappearance and displacement. And then the opposition over time became more radicalized. And now when we say the opposition, it really spanned the gamut over time. The longer the conflict continued, the more groups you had that were involved in the Syrian conflict. And then over time, you had regional powers who have vested interests in the outcome of the conflict, and some international actors also get involved. But it's important to understand that the Syrian conflict began as an indigenous pro-democracy movement. This was not a conspiracy to topple Assad. This was not an Israeli, a Zionist, or a Saudi, or Wahhabi, or a Turkish, or an Islamist, or Russian conspiracy. This was the Syrian people saying, we want change. Now, as the conflict continued, those countries I mentioned all naturally have interests in Syria. The Iranian regime depends on Syria to protect its allies in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and as a way to also limit its isolation from the international community and to provide it with a beachhead into the Arab world that it does seek to influence. That's what Iran wants. So Assad is crucial to them. Hezbollah has an interest in protecting Assad because they feel that they are in an existential fight, not against Israel, but to control Lebanon. And without Syrian support, they feel that their control of Lebanon would be in danger. And then obviously you have Turkey, you have the Saudis, and then you also have greater powers, Russia, the United States, the Europeans, all have interests, and we can talk about all of them. And over time, they got involved, and in a generic way, the United States and most Arab countries and Turkey sided with the opposition, the people who rose up against Assad. Russia, Hezbollah, and Iran sided with Assad for the reasons I mentioned to you. Where we are today is really the byproduct of those concentric circles of conflict. This is an intra-Syrian conflict. It's a regional proxy war now. It's an international competition between the US and Russia and maybe some of its allies in China in some cases. So it's really multiple layers now of conflict, which naturally complicates any efforts and desires to resolve it. And let's not forget that because of this instability and some intentional moves by the Assad regime and its allies, you also had the introduction of terrorist organizations, as we saw it with the so-called Islamic State or Daesh, with also Jabhat al-Nusra and others that came after them. These are real, and really what we've also not mentioned is to complicate the issue even further, the Kurdish people of Syria in the north, they also have aspirations, and some of their groups have some real aspirations. I'm referring here to the PYD, that also now are fighting out for their own interests and perhaps a piece of Syria in the north. And, I just described to you a very, very complicated now conflict. But what is important as a takeaway, that demand for change, justice, and now accountability is still there in Syria. There are plenty of Syrians who are not under Assad's control, especially in the north of the country. If you add them all up, there's about 6 million of them right now still out of his control. And inside of Syria, the war is not over in the sense that the root causes of this instability are still there. That's Assad. And really, most predict that even if the regime is declared the winner, those root causes that have not gone away will lead to further instability and perhaps kind of a revolution 2.0 or 3.0.
I know this was a very difficult. I know this was a very difficult job, but you did a wonderful job of describing us from a bird's eye view, the history and the current situation. And my follow-up question will be around some of the misperceptions around Syria, both in DC and in the broader public. But before that, in an effort to not merely make this into an issue of conflict between states and powers and warring, I want to talk about the human element and come to Suzanne to talk a little bit about the Syrian American community and the long history of Syrian American community. Those of us who study American Muslim history and immigration into the United States, we know that early on there are Syrian Americans in the United States. Can you give us a brief summary of this community? When do we see first arrivals? How has the migration patterns flowed chronologically? What are some of the overlaps or divergences within the Syrian American community? Where do Syrian Americans live in terms of states and cities? Just a bit of again, 101 on the Syrian American community from you, Suzanne.
Sure. And because you mentioned a very important word, going back to the human part of this conflict, I think Wael touched on a very important point, which was the start of this conflict was an indigenous movement by the people. And that movement is still now happening. There are people still now in areas in Syria that are going out into the streets demanding freedom from the Assad regime. And of course, Russia and Iran being the main regimes that are propping Assad up, basically. And so it's important for us to always go back to that point, because a lot of times we hear the international community say it's too complicated, we don't want to interfere, but this is simple. People just want freedom. And so very, very important point, Wyatt. Thanks for bringing that up. In terms of the Syrian American community, they really are a big and diverse group and a very talented group. One of the things that keeps us going through the difficult challenges that we hear on a daily basis in Syria is, although, there was a lot of unfortunate, fleeing, that refugees had to leave Syria and find refuge in other places. People had to leave their homes, their families, their country, their studies. Syrians have really found a way to get out into the world and take on opportunities that they would have never had under the Assad regime. And so going back a little bit in history onto when did Syrians, start coming in to the United States, the major migration began in the late 1800s. At that point, Syria was Greater Syria. It included Lebanon at that point. And so people started to migrate mainly to New York, They were still diverse back then. They went into different industries like dry goods, grocery, the garment industry, and they came in and made a home basically. And migration kept going through about 1919. At that point, there was a halt in migration due to some US migration laws. And those were actually abolished back in the 1960s, I think in 1965, and that's when migration began again. And between about 1965 to 2020, we can say about 64,000 people came in through migration. Today, we have about 200,000 Syrian Americans in the United States. It's hard to always have an actual accurate number because the consensus is always, Arabs or Middle Easterners, and I think there's some work around that to really pinpoint the numbers. But they are all over the US now, with major communities in Michigan, California, Illinois, the Chicago area especially, Florida, New York, New Jersey, West Virginia, the DMV, Washington, DC, Maryland, Virginia area. So they're really all over the place, with our largest communities being Chicago, Los Angeles, Detroit, and I'm sure I've missed some. But as far as their demographics, what they're doing, they do really well, Syrians and Syrian Americans. About their median income is usually higher than most migrants, even higher than those who were born in the US. About 11% are business owners, 27% end up going for higher education. And they're, learning a lot, especially now with everything that's happened in Syria and working on advocacy and politics. We're seeing a great surge in the millennial Syrian Americans who are interested in working in Washington, DC, getting their political science degrees. And that's something we especially push for as a community, but also as the Syrian American Council, because we do feel we need Syrian Americans on the scene in DC working for the betterment of Syrian Americans here and, of course, eventually Syria.
Thank you, Suzanne, for that. And again, that was wonderful. I live in Lehigh Valley in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and there's a large Syrian American community here near where I live. Yeah. So I'll quickly move back to Wael, and I want to remind our audience of a Twitter engagement you had, Wael, with Carl Bildt, a former EU official, currently a policy expert, who was commenting on the protests in Belarus, in Minsk, and commenting that that was one of the largest, gatherings that he has seen, kind of dissipating, raising the protests in Syria, in Egypt, in many other places, and you rightfully pointed out to that blind spot. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, what are some misperceptions around Syria, despite ongoing work by many of you, both in the policy circles and also in the broader public? And I want to maybe add one more point for you to answer, which is that why do we usually see this religious conflict and extremist emphasis in lieu of this emphasis on real demands by Syrians on the ground for democracy, for human rights, for basic rights?
Thank you. I don't know how much time you have if you want to talk about misconceptions, lies, and distortions about the Syrian conflict, because we can spend many hours. But it's absolutely ongoing, and it's very disappointing because it doesn't only come from the usual suspects. And the byproduct of it has been, in my opinion, is aiding, abetting the continuation of the Assad regime, and really undermining any legitimate efforts to provide for civilian protection, right? To protect civilians. You see the typical attacks and distortions that this is a revolution that's full of terrorists. This is really Al-Qaeda, or these are the Muslim Brotherhood, right? You'll hear this. They want to take over Syria, and that this is a fight between, the extremists and the secular Assad. Assad uses the veneer of caring for, minorities to justify its repression of the majority, which the rest of the world goes along with, because he understands that when he in his speech to the Americans or the Europeans, when he says, "I protect Christians, I'm a secular leader," he knows they like to hear that. And so that's one typical distortion, that this is terrorists, this is religious extremists who are going to take over Syria, which is not true. Syria is a place that enjoyed religious tolerance and intermingling between the various sects, and also the initial spark of the revolution and what underpinned it were civil society groups that were really not religious in nature, and even those that were religious in nature worked with Christians, with Druze, with Alawis. So that distortion really aided and abetted Assad, so he could rally the international community or to, force them to rationalize why he should stay in power. Another one, which is, in my opinion, even more pernicious, it comes from the left. It comes from the so-called anti-imperialist movement, whereby you see many people on the far left, and many of them are in the US now. They cannot fathom that the people of Syria could, of their own accord, want to replace their government. It must be an international conspiracy. It must be, yet again, another regime change effort by the United States and the Israelis, and the Saudis for some reason. It completely strips agency of the people of Syria. You would think that progressives would give some kind of agency to the indigenous movements of the world, that they would be for civilian protection and countering, hate and xenophobia and repression of people. But no, they really have such an issue that they justify what's happening as a grand conspiracy, that this is not going to benefit the Syrian people, and they oppose it. And it's terrible, and it's very, very sad. So to me, and I know there's many more, I can tell you that both the right with their xenophobia and Islamophobia, and unfortunately some in the left with their blind anti-imperialism, that both of them end up distorting what's happening in Syria to the detriment of the Syrian people.
Thank you for that. Well, and I think you've touched on that question of agency, and I think we keep coming back to that. I want to briefly go to Suzanne with a question that I know that while you, having worked with Samantha Power, also care deeply about, or should be thinking deeply about, which is around intervention, humanitarian intervention. How can we avoid interventionism, but at the same time still stand with the Syrian people? What is the what are some of the considerations within the Syrian American community? How does Syrian American Council itself sort of navigate these lines to not fall into pitfalls of the interventionist cycle that started with Iraq and all of that, but at the same time still not stand inept when there's chemical weapons being used, despite drawing red lines in Washington and all of that.
Thanks, Amit. And I'm sure Wael will have a lot to add to this particular point, but I just wanted to, again, bringing it back to the human aspect, and Wael touched a bit on this, how can we not intervene when people are being killed by their government? How can we not intervene when a president is letting out prisoners, criminals from his own prisons to go out and literally take knives and cut the throats of children? And I'm sorry to be so graphic, but I think we need to hear this. How can you stand and say, let's not do anything about Syria and interfere when people are dying under chemicals and on a daily basis, and barrel bombs are falling on their head from their own, again, the army that's supposed to protect them. And I realize there are so many definitions to intervention. But those who, it's a little disheartening when for so many years we've worked to bring attention and help to the Syrian people that are still today being bombarded and dying, by the way, that there are groups that stood against us and said, nope, let's not interfere, let's not do anything. So you're talking about not intervening because you don't want to see war, yet people are dying. So where's the where's the logic in that? And again, I know I'm simplifying the conversation very much. However, those are questions people need to ask themselves. And, going back to the different definitions of interfering, as the Syrian American Council, we've always asked for the no-fly zone. And there's always the concept of, do we want boots on the ground? Do we not? No one wants to see their boots on the ground going into conflict. We all want to protect, our military, but there are conversations that need to happen. And there were situations where other governments had the ability to be on the ground and to be able to safely maneuver no-fly zone. And still, the green light was never given for such, such protection. And so you wonder where was the international community in those conversations? We as the US, why don't we take, more action to protect more people? And so those are things we really need to look at and dive in deeply. But today, the picture is very different. Today, intervening can be also defined in many different ways. Today, there are areas like what I mentioned that are not under regime control, that have huge potential in developing and growing to show what a free Syria can actually look like when it's not under oppression from a regime. And so intervening in this case can be helping those areas grow, developing them, projects, bringing in literature and education on democracy and how you function in a democratic world. We're all seeing that there's so much for our communities outside Syria and inside Syria to learn how to work together, how to practice democracy. The Assad regime scared people so much to the point that the regime used tactics to scare people from each other. So people didn't trust each other. People are afraid to work together. And now they're learning to work as team members, to work to create, a democratic world, basically. And so that's the point I like to discuss in this case. And I would love to hear Wael's take on intervention.
I'm a believer in the responsibility to protect, which is an actual doctrine regarding the ethics and legality of intervention to defend civilians, including from their own government. Very few countries, actually, I don't know of any country that has adopted this doctrine, though, but it is one that I believe in, and I believe is the ultimate answer to this issue. Because right now, there are valid arguments against intervention. You look at the legacy of the Iraq War and what happened in Afghanistan, and a long history of American, Western misadventures in different parts of the world. I understand that. And all too often, interventions to topple governments or to remake a society are tricky at best and most likely to fail. But that is not what we're talking about in Syria. We're talking about defending civilians. There has to be a place whereby you allow for the use of military power if you're not seeking to change a regime, but you also don't want to stand and do nothing. And unfortunately, we're all too often given this binary description that, oh, you want us to go to Syria and topple Assad? We don't want to go there and topple Assad. Well, what about just going there and defending some people while he stays in power, where you say, this is the line that you cannot cross? And there are many precedents for this. That is exactly how we prevented the complete annihilation of the Bosnian people in the 90s. That was a military intervention that was focused on protecting civilians in Bosnia, and it succeeded. It saved many, many lives. And it did not lead to World War III, and the Russians were as interested in protecting their Serbian friends as anyone else. So there is historical precedence there where not every military intervention is going to be like Iraq. We have to be smarter than that. And that's where the elements on the right and the left, who I just told you, are working to undermine what's happening. They will use these straw man argument. They will use these false analogies because for them, it serves the purpose of scaring people of supporting any support of the Syrian people, because remember, they're driven by those biases that I described to you earlier.
Thank you to both of you for these answers. And what I want to do next is to go to questions that we are receiving on Zoom and on Facebook. The first question we'll pose is from one of our local Syrian American leaders, Brother Yatek Yedin, one of our mentors, and he asks this. It's a bit lengthy, but I think it is worthwhile to cover it. He asks, what advice would you give to people of the human race to help the Syrian people on a humanitarian level? And how would we engage in the political process to help our Syrian brothers and sisters? We all saw the destruction and bloodshed, and we hear conflicting stories about the different elements that are at the root cause of the conflict. He says some people mentioned the question is, were the Syrian people better off before the revolution? Or is what we are seeing in Syria now a natural and normal growing pain of that great nation of Syria? So I think that's a question for both of you. Especially, I think there are two parts to the question. One is, what can those of us who may not be part of the Syrian American community do about to help the situation? And the second is, what would you say to those who might be thinking, maybe we're better off before this whole thing because look at what it has led to?
Who goes first?
Yeah, go for it. There's many questions in there, so.
I know. I'll take some and I will give you some. The question about was Syria better off if this never happened? I think the only people that can answer that question are the people inside Syria who actually went out into the streets and asked for freedom. And I would like to get back to how the story actually happened and what drove them to actually go into the street. But when the Arab Spring first started, it started in Tunisia, of course, where Bouazizi, a man who was selling vegetables on a cart, was asked to move his cart from a policewoman for no reason at all. And she kept coming at him. She would ask him to move it. He would need to pay her money for her to leave him alone. And then finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He has to be there. He has to sell vegetables to feed his children. But he was so frustrated at the situation that he burnt himself and he died. And that started the movement in Tunisia, and the Arab Spring began going through different Arab countries because most of Arab countries are suffering from the same dictatorships that we see in Syria. And frankly, Syria has gone to a whole different level, of course, but that's how the Arab Spring started. And people wondered, would we see the same spring erupt inside Syria? And many of us said, no way, this would not happen. The Syrians would be too afraid. We didn't know there was a whole world happening on social media where actually young millennials were working on going out and really, because they've had it. And like what I said, this wasn't a project to topple the regime. Many just really wanted to go out and have conversations, and even when they did end up in the streets, would offer roses to the military, to Assad's military, to say, listen, we're not here, we don't want you out, we want to just sit down and talk, let's fix things, let's make sure we all become one country that can live freely. But what happened was, as all this was brewing, some teenagers in the city of Daraa were listening to the news and we're hearing some of the slogans like the Shah Beauty, the Sqat al-Nidam, the people want the fall of the regime. And they, wrote some graffiti on their school walls, something saying, hey, Bashar, your turn is coming up. Well, the police in the city captured those kids. They were teenagers, 12, 13, 14, took them to prison, tortured those kids. And tortures, again, I don't like to be graphic, but we need to understand what kind of monsters we're working with. Literally would cut off, their nails, would torture them in just many different terrible manners. And when the parents, were infuriated and went and asked to get their children back, the police said, you're not getting your children back. Go make new ones if you want children. So that's the dirtiness of this regime. And so at that point, the people of the city couldn't take it anymore. And that's how they went out into the streets asking for reform, for change. They wanted their kids back. And this erupted through the different cities. And this is how the spring actually began in Syria. And so these stories we now hear, the hundreds of thousands of prisoners that are detained for political reasons, just because they spoke up, just because they were trying to say how they felt, people who tried to help those injured during the protests, those people were taken into prison. You know, no one could speak, no one could say anything, no one could breathe. And if people in Syria are still today going out into the streets and asking for freedom, even after all this, I have a feeling the answer is going to be no, we are not better off, because we were already living in a prison, and now at least the world can see it. Maybe we didn't get the help we needed, but at least now we see it. And we all know from history, revolutions take years. I know it's easy for us to say that, but no one outside Syria made the decision to go out into the streets and ask for this. People inside Syria went in, and I think we need to respect the fact that they did, and we do need to figure out how to help them. And I'll turn it to Wael.
You know, whether it is people living, you know, are better off now or before, I mean, it depends who you ask. People who've lost everything, they'll probably say no, it wasn't worth it for them. But that's a really irrelevant question. It's a relevant question because you have to judge things in the moment that they happen and what they say about the conditions they were in. And the same conditions exist now all over again. And so the more important question is this acceptable for humanity writ large? Was this worth it for me? That I, with my privilege, allowed this to happen? What value did that get me? And what regrets does that create? And so therefore, what can people do? What they can do is, number one, learn the facts, make sure that you counter lies and distortions, which we just discussed. So speak up, just speak up, know the issue and speak up. And if you really want to do something, speak on behalf of the Syrian people who are asking for international protection. And so you making the same ask of your lawmakers, your elected officials, of your colleagues, and take those decisions if you are in a position of power. That's what you can do. Really, there's no secret formula. But unfortunately, so far humanity has not even done the basic.
Thank you both for addressing this question, and I think it has opened up a lot of pathways to think about it. So I want to come back, and I know, Wael, you touched on this briefly, but Suzanne, especially considering the work of Syrian American Council and many other organizations, what are some concrete ways that non-Syrian Americans contribute to a more principled American policy on Syria? What are some direct ways for people to join advocacy efforts?
Sure, and I'd love to tell you a little bit about how the Syrian American Council came to existence, because I love the story. But basically, the founder of the Syrian American Council came together with a group of folks in Chicago and decided that since they've never had the platform to be able to speak freely, they do need some sort of platform. They want to be able to come together, speak up, and somehow work with their US government to see how they can bring, a better future to Syria. And at that point, it was in working with the Syrian government, because that was actually back in 2005. So Syrian American Council is actually now 15 years old. Of course, it was all volunteer-based, so that work was very slow. But then when the revolution actually started, that's when they came together and said, we need to be in Washington, D.C. We need to have a staff. And that's how we came about in Washington, D.C. And we work on 3 levels: government relations, public relations, and grassroots relations. And ever since, we have been in that realm. And actually, the most challenging part of our job is the grassroots relations, because Syrian Americans have never actually had the opportunity to work and speak to their government. So when we talk about going and talking to your representative and discussing Syria and asking for change and asking for reform and working on US policy for Syria, to many, that is such a unheard of point. Now, of course, things have changed, and the community has really learned so much and has come together and is establishing great groups and C3s and C4s and political committees, etc. But for a long time, that was such a foreign thought and foreign movement. And we needed to really convince people. And our community tends to flow towards humanitarian work because that's more tangible. They feel that's how they can help. But again, I think we're all learning how much advocacy does help. And we saw, you know, most recently, for instance, the CAIR Act, which is a group of sanctions that sanctions very, you know, it literally targets specifically the regime and people who work with the regime and entities who support the regime that you know, is a killing machine basically, and also protects the civilians by providing special points for aid, etc., so that the people aren't touched, but only the certain criminals are touched. And so that took years of work. I think the community there saw that we actually can make a difference. Our voices can bring change. And so we're seeing that happen, but we still need so much help there. And so we really need everyone that can come and take a look at our work. You know, like what I said, ask the questions, don't turn, to the side, don't walk away from it because it appears to be a complicated situation. It is, but you know, again, it's very simple. People want freedom from their oppressors. And so we need to be able to speak on those people's behalf, because just like we have freedoms that we enjoy here, you know, at any moment we could lose some of that if we don't protect it here. And so if we protect it in our own country in the US, we have to protect it for the rest of the world so that it is protected for everybody. And so we would love for people to ask us questions, come work with us, join our mailing list, because we talk a lot about the action items we do there. You know, donate to us, because we do need to bring on more people, more staff to work in DC, to bridge people, you know, in the communities with their representatives locally and at the DC level, and really be able to create a working machine to bring attention to the Syrian people. And, you know, of course, you all at CAIR know that very well, because that's what you do. And so we want to be able to do the same for the Syrian people.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Suzanne, for that. Well, if you can also take the same question working with Emgage. We know that we do many partnerships on the policy level. If you can briefly mention about your work and then direct advocacy, inclusion work from your end.
Sure. Yeah, we have a few legislative and issue advocacies that we pursue. One of the biggest one is supporting legislation to effectively repeal the Muslim ban. And so we were early supporters and we worked on the draft legislation with other organizations for the No Ban Act, which was just passed in the US House of Representatives, by the way. We're very proud of that. Another one is the No Hate Act, which seeks to increase both penalties, but also improve data collection that would help with understanding the real problem of hate crimes against different groups of people. So that's something we're working on. We're also working on legislation to support the people of Myanmar, the Rohingya. And we've supported sanctions on the Burmese military, both government and the military. We're also supported the Uyghur Human Rights Act, which laid targeted sanctions against Chinese officials for the Communist parties, the Chinese Communist Party's violations of the human rights of the Uyghur people. We're also supporting draft resolutions and perhaps bills in the future to address the discriminatory laws passed by the Modi government against its ethnic and religious minorities, especially the Muslims. And finally, there is a Protecting Palestinian Children Act that we've been supporting now for a few years, and we just reintroduced by Betty McCollum from Minnesota, that would seek to defund Israel to defund it so it cannot be used they cannot use our aid to detain or harm or torture children. So that's a bill that we are supportive of, and I know that CAIR has also supported that bill as well. So it's, as you can see, it's a mix of domestic and foreign. It's a big, buckets, but that's the nature of our community. We just care about too many issues.
Indeed, and thank you to both of you. As we are coming to an end, I wanted to address two issues that is at the intersection of Islamophobia, how Muslim issues broadly are viewed. One is that question that Val, you also touched upon, which is how did the Muslim ban impact Syrians, both those who are going through the conflict or who might be in places like Lebanon, like Turkey, like many other places that hold many Syrians. One question is that, and then the other is one that Jacob had highlighted, which is that the Islamophobes' use of the case of Syria to argue for the incompatibility of Islam and democracy, and all of that, which is then related to this question that I think, well, you have highlighted, that some argue both on the right and then on the left that it's only the Assad government that can protect the religious minorities, whether that be the Christians, the Druze, or the Alawites. So those three issues, if we can touch on those, and then end with, then there will be one more question, which is around what we see in the media, how reflective of it is of the realities on the ground, and what are some blind spots that we all experience because American/Western media's either biases or issues regarding the subject. So if we can start with the Muslim ban and the incompatibility question, I think that would be great.
I'll say a couple of things about the Muslim ban, if it's okay, and then I'd love to hear from Wael. Obviously, because many Syrian Americans decided, had the courage finally to become vocal about the Assad regime. This all happened in 2011, of course, when the revolution started. In the past, no one could ever say anything, but now suddenly there was this movement happening that looked like things could move in a better place for Syria. And so people started speaking up. They had the courage finally, something they've never done in their life. And because they did that, now they could no longer go back to Syria and ever visit Syria, because of course they would be taken right at the airport to prison to be tortured, most likely killed. And so to see family, they had to count on family coming over to see them and spend time with them. And then you have the other side too. Many Syrians had to flee Syria and come find refuge in the US, etc. And now families were all over the place. They were not together. I mean, now, you hold a Zoom call during COVID to get families together, and literally they're in Germany, in the US, in Sweden, in Turkey, Lebanon, they're all over, and they can't be together. And some haven't seen their parents in 8 and 9 years because of this Muslim ban that took a hold, basically. I think, we have some crazy numbers onto how many refugees were allowed in the last few years, and no one can come and visit anymore. And so families who were already now could not see each other, they're devastated by what's happening in their country, are now even more devastated because logistical movement was not possible. And so the Syrians have had to endure suffering on many levels, and this sort of added to their suffering because they couldn't even find comfort in each other. Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's been devastating, but I mean, Syrian refugees are now one of the biggest groups of refugees worldwide. So naturally, if you have a ban on them coming to the US, it's going to affect them severely. So when I was at the State Department, I believe the Obama administration ultimately brought maybe 12 or 15,000 Syrians to the United States. Could do a lot more, but that's the number. 50 Syrians have been able to come to the US since Trump has come to office. 50. So, and that really drives the point home of if people don't know whom they should vote for in November. I mean, I don't know what they're smoking, really, because it's unconscionable. So 50 people from the millions of Syrians who are now refugees were allowed to come to the US. People should know this. Yeah, so it's been extremely harmful. And you asked something about the media coverage, and it used to be the 24-hour news cycle. Now it's the the TikTok 5-second or 10-second cycle. That's what it is. So there was the initial attention, great coverage. I remember Anderson Cooper used to do a lot of coverage about Syria, what's happening. And then it just faded from the public consciousness. And now we're in the 10th year. People want to move on, and things may sometimes spark in enough way to get people to refocus on it a little bit, but then they continue on with the next thing that happened, to that, something else related to the pop culture or something else. So they've moved on. It does not get the attention. There's a few heroic journalists who still will try to write something about Syria or point the light on it. But it's now, I would say it's almost non-existent. It's very disappointing.
May I add something actually to that? So as Wael was saying, because media ebbs and flows, one of the reasons Syria came back into the news recently was because of COVID-19. Because, of course, that's the story of the world, if you will. And COVID-19 is running around like crazy inside Syria because the regime denied that it even had any cases. So silly, some of the regime media, they would even say, gosh, we're handling COVID so well that people, countries are calling us to ask us what we're doing. And just silly media from the regime side. But these cases were being denied and hidden. A lot of it actually came from Iranian militia that was coming in to help the Assad regime kill Syrians asking for freedom. And that's how COVID came through. And now it's really running rampant. People are dying at just crazy numbers. Hospitals, because they don't know how to deal with the virus, are not even accepting some patients. So people are dying at a very quick rate, even quicker than many other countries. And areas that are free of the regime, we've actually tried to do some education on staying social distancing, etc. And they laugh at us sometimes. They say, listen, we've had 9 years of bombardment. Now you're asking us to be scared of a virus. And when they saw the severity, I think they started, taking on some of these precautions. But even then, people are in camps. How could they distance? There are many families living in one tent, etc. Great Syrian American doctors, like from the Syrian American Medical Society, have done some work, tried to do some education. The White Helmets have done some work. Lots of wonderful organizations on the ground have done some great education. So there's been a little bit better control in those areas, but it's still a very scary aspect, and we're expecting more numbers to come through and more cases and more deaths. Actually, one of the fundraisers we're doing currently that you can also find on our website, and maybe we can send it to your members, but we're doing a Masks for Idlib campaign. So we're actually working with other organizations on the ground. We're hiring people and creating workshops to actually make masks, and then those masks will be distributed so that people can at least have masks, since they won't be able to social distance. But another very scary aspect, and because of that, we were able to get some media around it, and many wrote about it. But just another story. Yeah.
Indeed. Once again, thank you to both of you. We've come to the end of our time, and it's our experience that our audience who watches this later on benefits from the resource. So what I'm going to do is to put here the website for Syrian American Council, for Emgage, for CAIR-Philadelphia. We ask everyone to be engaged with these organizations, to join the advocacy work, to join the humanitarian work, and to make sure that you keep directing people to programs like this one, which the recording will be available at the site that I've just posted. So once again, I wanted to thank both Suzanne Meriden and Alzayat for joining us, for giving us their expertise, for reminding us of the importance of human connection, the human stories, and that Syria is not just a geopolitical story that big players crash one another. There are human lives at stake, and we very much hope and pray that it finds peace, that it finds stability, and it finds the wealth that it so much deserves. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. I am trying to see that we are thankful to everyone who were able to join us on Zoom and on Facebook. Jacob, any last words? Wonderful. Thank you again to everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
You'll definitely
so
be
much.
sending out more resources.
Thank you.
Thank you.